Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue our journey with the Prophet in Babylon, Chapter 12, Part A. The Mayfield Avenue Church was crowded to its utmost limits. It was the first Sunday morning in February. On the previous Sunday, Guant had announced that on this Sunday he proposed making a statement which affected the future of the church and his own relationship to it. This announcement had had the effect which might have been expected. Curiosity was whetted to its keenest edge, and speculation ran high. The press, which had been silent for several weeks, awoke into sudden activity. Far and wide, paragraphs had been circulated containing more or less exact information relating to the church and its minister. During the week, the telephone on Gaunt's desk had been ringing incessantly. Reporters had dogged his steps. Letters from former members of the church had reached him, asking for explanations. To all these people, Guant had made the same reply. Let them be present on the morning of the first Sunday in February, and they would hear all he had to say. Until then, he intended to maintain absolute silence. Roberts had been among the first to seek an interview with Guant. He came early on the morning after the announcement, precise and prim as ever, yet plainly agitated.
"What was the nature of the expected statement?"
he asked point blank. Guant quietly answered him that he would hear in due course, but this reply was far from satisfying to Roberts. He ventured to hope that Guant was not about to do anything rash or ill-considered. "Not at all," Guant replied. He was at that moment giving the closest consideration to his statement, and had been engaged in the same consideration for weeks past.
"Ought not such a statement to be made first to the deacons?"
urged Roberts. They were authorized managers of the church. They were all tried friends. They would be glad to advise him, and so forth. Guant had his own opinion about the friendship, which he did not state. On the other points he spoke plainly. "I need no advice," he said. "I do not recognize any special right of the deacons to stand between myself and the congregation in this matter. What I shall say affects the entire congregation, and it is to them I prefer to speak." Robert's agitation increased each moment. It was in part resentment at Gaunt's independence. Ever since the refusal of the celery, he had been chagrined by the knowledge that Guant had escaped from his control, that he had no real hold over him. It was in part fear. Who could foresee what a man so eccentric as Guant might say? Why, he might rip up the whole past, declare the entire story of the series of mean economies which Robert had inaugurated, repeat things that happened in secrecy of deacons' meetings, in fact, expose Roberts and his party to ridicule and blame. Or, again, he might be about to propose some revolutionary policy to the church. Had he not already discontinued the vesper service of his own initiative, and covered the neighborhood with undignified placards inviting people to a weeknight service which was in the nature of a crude revival meeting? Had he not already attracted to the church a number of people whom no one wished to see, people of the plain and scarlet type, who could add nothing to the financial strength of the church, whose very presence indeed dimmed its social prestige? And now, no doubt, some other mad scheme was afoot, some wild appeal to the people, the effect of which would be disastrous for the dignity of the church. Again, Roberts felt, as he had so often, a certain incalculable element in Guant, something that baffled him, that made him impotent, that dismayed him. The one thing he did not suspect was that Guant meditated resignation. He knew perfectly well that a minister rarely resigned a church without another in view, and he shrewdly calculated that Gaunt's position was such that very few churches would desire his services. For he had talked with Jordan, and he was aware that Gaunt's reputation was greatly compromised by what 9 men out of 10 would describe as his eccentric behavior. And the churches wanted not eccentric men, however gifted, but safe men. A man in Gaunt's position must needs stay on until he had worn out his congregation or found some too credulous church willing to entrust its destinies to him. But that he should resign, that he should go out into the world penniless, that was a supposition quite incredible to a man of Robert's temperament, to whom all forms of unselfishness are insanity, and all self-sacrifice imposture. Yet what Roberts could not see nor suspect was already evident to most people. It was particularly evident to Tasker, who called on Guant and spent nearly an hour in remonstrances. The little man was genuinely grieved at the turn affairs had taken, and he also hoped that Guant was not about to do anything rash. Not but what a bold stroke might succeed, but then there were other things to consider. For instance, it might not. On general principles, he favored the safe course. No doubt there had been some misunderstandings, but then they were not all on one side. These things acted and reacted. Of course, Guant would do what he thought right, and at this the little man's voice vibrated with a kind of Martin Luther, "Here I take my stand" accent. But then other people must be considered, and it was better to be cast into the sea with a millstone around your neck than to offend one of these little ones. To which exposition of incompetence Guant listened with amused interest, wondering all the time how it was possible for men of Tasker's temperament to go through the world at all, and contrive to make money enough to live, especially that world of New York, where the man who did not know what he wanted usually got nothing at all. So the week passed, and the morning of the first Sunday in February had come, Gaunt's last Sunday in the Mayfield Avenue church, and the church was crowded. The doors were no sooner opened than people began to assemble. Some of the first to arrive were people from distant suburbs, former members, who knew very little of the latter developments in the church. These were soon beckoned into pews occupied by old acquaintances, and wherever they came, a buzz of conversation broke out. "What does it all mean?" was one question bandied to and fro, to which all kinds of conflicting answers were returned. "Does he mean resigning?" "We think so." "But why? What have you been doing to him?" said one irascible old gentleman who had been a great admirer of Guant in the early days of his ministry. Whereupon someone began to whisper to him a long explanation, which evidently afforded him no satisfaction, for the irascible old gentleman declaimed in a loud voice that they were a parcel of fools who didn't know when they were well off. He would probably have said much more, but at this moment Mrs. Somerset swept into the pew, with a sense of calm proprietorship, although for months she had not occupied it, and at once elevated her lorgnette inimitable insolence, as much to say, "Dear me, who can all these strange people be who have dared to invade the seclusion of a church where I worship?" Still the crowd flowed in, to the evident surprise of Roberts, who moved up and down the aisles pale and anxious. Very soon every pew was filled, and chairs were being placed inside the communion rails. Among the latecomers were several men prominent in the higher circles of New York life, whose names were passed from lip to lip in excited whispers as they were recognized. With them came also men of quite another class, plainly dressed in decent ready-made clothes, men with the sturdy aspect of superior mechanics, with thoughtful eyes and good foreheads. There were many young men and a few fashionably dressed women who made a point to miss no notable event in the life of the city, the kind of women who adore Wagner and Theosophy one week and run after the latest preacher or boy violinist who may happen to be in fashion the next. Every moment brought its sensation, and the climax came when 4 reporters were grudgingly afforded places just beneath the pulpit. And someone had started the rumor that the quiet old gentleman in the corner beneath the gallery, who had the air of a substantial farmer, was the greatest millionaire in the world, and that his neighbors were 2 celebrated editors. For New York, that city of sensation, much more avid than the ancient Athens for a new thing, had divined by some swift intuition that something strange was fated to happen today. and that behind the suggestive paragraphs which the press had flung far and wide, there was something concealed much more important than the possible resignation of a noted minister. Still the people came, till now every chair was occupied. Even the sacred precincts of the choir gallery were invaded, and the vestibule was filled with people for whom no seats could be obtained. As the time for the commencement of the service drew near, a solemn hush fell upon the great assembly, and then, as though a magic wand had been passed over the congregation, some of those more serious elements which had hitherto been concealed began to manifest themselves. A subtle change passed over the faces of those who had come through mere curiosity. The look of levity, that look of vivacious shallowness so common in a New York crowd, died away, giving place to grave interest. It was as though everything in the aspect of these faces had deepened. Something real was urging its way through the veneer of the artificial, so that the lines grew sharp, the very eyes had deeper color, the fashion of the countenance was changed. And now, to the nobler and graver faces in the crowd challenged by the observant eye, there were many such, the face of men and women who had looked upon the tragedy of life, whose eyes had known the terror of solitary thought and retained the shadow of that terror. What did they expect? They could not have said, but yet they betrayed the consciousness of some vast anticipation, as though from some high tower of silence they waited for the dayspring. And in some subtle, wholly inexplicable manner, they seemed to communicate their own emotion to the crowd, till that waiting look suffused the entire congregation. It spread like an invisible wave, submerging in its flow all meaner elements, so that at the last the silence became almost painful in its intensity. And then, with a shock that thrilled the nerves, the first low note of the organ shook the air, and the strain was relaxed. The service had commenced. That's the end of Chapter 12, Part A. We'll pick up with Chapter 12, Part B next week. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.